Good morning, everyone. I think our staff are going to outnumber our students, but we always think it's good to have a chance to have a chat with the students about what's going on. And I know you are all very good at sharing information. So that is one of the things that we want to make sure is that everyone gets the information they need and desire. So I think we're 4 minutes after, so we will probably get started. So welcome to our students to a student forum. It is a small group. There'll be plenty of time for questions. And as I said, it's a chance for us to try to as openly and transparently tell you about the state of the university and what we're trying to do. We have to continue to make decisions, and I want you all as part of our community to understand what we're doing. And as I said, put your own opinions out there for us to consider. And obviously we have our student representatives on council that help with that. And we do have students involved in many of the committees and things we do. I'd like to start this morning by acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional lands and airways we're meeting. I'm joining you from campus today on Ngunnawal Ngambri land. I pay my respects to elders past and present. So we'll do our best to answer questions. If you have a question that stumps us, then we're happy to take it on notice. We are joined today from our Chief Financial Officer, Anna Skouras, who's visiting us from a long ways away in Munich. But we want to go through so you all understand our 2021 financial results. Because these results obviously affect you as much as they affect us. And so it's important for you to understand where we are and where things are likely to go. As a piece of entertainment, we thought, or maybe intellectual enrichment, maybe would be a better way to describe Mark Kenny from the Australian Studies Institute. Happy to talk a little bit around the election. You might want to ask him questions as someone who's been there at the front line, asking politicians what's going on, and get a sense of using some of the people we have here on talented people we have here on staff. So it's designed as Liv has just put on the chat to be an interactive forum. So students, it's okay to put your videos on because it means that I'm not just talking into an abyss. It gives us a little bit of color so that I can see if anyone is out there. I do ask you to keep your microphones muted until you want to ask a question. You can ask questions if you're more comfortable through the chat function. The forum is being recorded and will be available online. And when we get to questions, raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. You can post in chat. And if you want to remain anonymous to peers and to the recording, you can email to vc.messages@anu.edu.au, and Liv will post that there. And well, obviously, Liv will know that you have asked a question. She won't tell me. The last 2 years, 2 and a bit years, have been very challenging for everyone around the world. And I know to our students, especially over the last couple of years, it has been hard. We can see the students on campus and the ones who are able to get back to campus. I know people are enjoying themselves. We're obviously in the middle, the business end of the semester. So it's lots of work, but I see lots of smiling faces around campus. And I think our staff have really enjoyed being able to interact with the students because the students provide the life to a campus and I think make universities what they are. So it is great to have those of you who can be back on campus. COVID continues to be a major constraint, and to our students who are unable to be on campus, those internationally, we're trying to be as flexible as possible to accommodate all paths until you're able to return on campus. We will continue to try to do that, although we do encourage everyone, if they do get the opportunity to come on campus, as it's just a much better environment than we can provide online. Although we, as I say, will continue to do our best. For those of you here in Canberra, ACT Health relaxed the requirement for household contacts this week. So it means that a person who is symptom-free, who has been a close contact with someone with COVID, no longer has to undergo mandatory isolation, but we are asking people to be sensible and smart and not spread disease. So please, if you are a close contact, try to minimize your movement within the community, comply with the risk mitigation requirements, including registering your status with ACT Health, do rat testing frequently, and if you get any symptoms at all, go get tested and try not to spread to anyone else. Really encourage you not to to enter high risk settings, and please continue to be vigilant on wearing masks indoor. That's something we're doing at ANU, and we will continue to do in most places for a while longer. I know it sucks. I hate wearing them as much as everyone else, but what it is allowing us to do is to operate pretty normally here without having large numbers of our staff get COVID, so they're unable to teach. And also note that if you're a 65-year-old professor, your ability to effectively repel COVID as a disease is about 100 times less than if you're 23 or 20. And so I'm trying not to take out the professoriate. They're very valuable, and I appreciate everyone being so good at doing this. As I said, we will try as the Omicron and its siblings evolve and our immune systems evolve, it will become less and less of a problem, we hope, over the coming months. But COVID is not going away. It is going to be with us. And so the goal is to manage it effectively. Masks are, as I said, probably the highest bang for lowest cost on us that we can do. So I would expect to have them continue through the semester in our classrooms and in confined spaces. We are going to be looking at how we might start relaxing in certain public spaces and in residences, but we need to, that's not going to happen instantly, but I think you can expect an evolution over the coming months in those spaces. So we will continue to work with ACT Health and our own experts to try to get that balance between what is, as you know, safe and what is practical. And as I said, we do understand the impost on everyone doing it. If you have any ideas, there is a work environment group that is happy for ideas, and it will be posted in the chat as well. And so I do encourage everyone to continue to be common sense as possible. We are going to have, as we go into winter, COVID tends to have sort of a 6-week cycle where it kind of goes ups and downs on its own. But as we go into winter, we will get a stronger dose of COVID almost certainly in the coming weeks. So I do encourage you to not be incredibly reckless, especially you don't want to get COVID in the middle of exam periods and stuff, because that just is a pain for you as individuals. If you are having issues, talk to your course convener about study arrangements, for example, if you're a household contact, et cetera, et cetera. This is World Immunization Week. Now, there is something I bet you did not know. So we are finding that a lot of people are have gotten their two vaccines. The third booster makes a huge difference. And I can tell you that some young people are really getting sick from COVID still, and the booster really helps. That third booster really helps. So that's still available on campus. And we're also offering flu shots. Those of us have forgotten what flu is like. It really sucks when you get flu. It makes you really sick, and we can help control flu by getting a flu shot. And that is also available, again, for free on campus. So we have been busy this year going through and trying to really work on improving and evolving what students get to do at ANU. And I know Grady and Marianne have been working hard with academic board, students, and staff about graduate attributes. That is, what are the things that we want students to leave here, every student to leave here with? And one of the things that we talk about across the world is critical thinking, but making sure that we don't just talk about it, but we actually deliver the things that students need for critical thinking. And so those graduate attributes will start being embedded in the curriculum in the years to come. And I encourage you to take a chance to ask questions if you have any, or to work with us to really bring to life what the graduate attributes might be. Grady and her team also launched the Student First program late last year, which is focusing on improving our experiences across the student journey. And that's the little things add up. It's in its discovery phase. And so we're still wanting to work with all of you to sort of create the roadmap of places we're going to put our efforts. And that will be finalized in June this year. Sally Wheeler's team, part of the International Strategy Portfolio, is developing a future student microsite that will go live later this year that'll help people understand the things they need to know and the decisions they need to make before they get here. So that will be going out. And again, we always look forward to your input on things like that. Ian Anderson and his team have implemented a new orientation and a transition framework for semester one. It helps produce what we hope are high quality and a kind of coordinated approach to how students get their orientation on campus and how we help students go from often living at home for their entire lives and transitioning to the university experience on students, noting we all start from different places. We've expanded the well-being service offerings to all international students on campus and overseas. And we've been working very hard, as we've told you about, on student safety on the well-being plan released last month. That was 9 months of consultation went into that within independent experts. As part of this, Council has agreed that we are going to create a dedicated new standing committee for Council that will oversee student safety and well-being and make sure that we are absolutely accountable to the highest level. These are really hard places to work, and we absolutely have to make sure that we set a standard that is the best in Australia, leading the world, because we are such a student-intensive campus. And so our problems are here on campus, and so we have to set the standard. And hopefully other people will use what we do in their own bids. We have within the ANU residences, as part of this new set of efforts, a new chief residential services officer, and we are investing in more staffing capacity within the residence to help provide a better and safer environment for everyone. We're about to go out to market for new case managers to help students when things do happen. And we're working closely with the colleges, with the residences, the student associations, so that we can better support victim survivors when incidences occur. We absolutely need to have everyone be safe on this campus. And so we're going to spend a lot of time on prevention. And prevention ultimately means working with the students, because it has to be done hand in hand with the students, because that is where our challenges lie. So I do thank Grady, Marianne, but especially Ian and his team for putting so much effort in this. And we're happy to answer questions. They are on the call this morning if you have questions. So finally, I want to just make sure that we're all on the same page financially. We had a chat to our staff on Wednesday. The finances of the university, as people will realize, were very challenged by COVID. In 2021, we recovered a bit, partially due to the one-off investment by the Australian federal government in research. But we are going to have a challenging next couple of years, but one that we think we can manage. And I'm going to hand over to Anna Sokoris, our Chief Financial Officer, who will run you through what our finances look like, so you are on the same page as all of us. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Brian, and good morning, everyone. As Brian said, I'll just take you briefly through the 2021 financial results, but also our results around our socially responsible investment. And I'll just touch on these at a fairly high level, but happy to take any questions as we go along at the end. So if we start off with the 2021 financial results, we're reporting two results here, and I'll just explain the difference between them. So the first is that if we look at our operational result for 2021, we had a surplus of just over $30 million. We had budgeted a deficit of $120 million. So it's a significant change from what we had expected, but we'll work through in the next slide just to explain that breakdown and how we ended up with that significant variance. Then if we look at our financial statements that will be published in our annual report, they have been submitted through to Parliament. So once they're tabled, then the annual report will be published. But our reported result there is $232.4 million. And last year, if we compare, so 2021 was 232 million. If we compare to 2020, that was a 17.7 million deficit. So also quite a big improvement compared to the prior year. As Brian mentioned a little bit, it does include funding from the Australian government, for example, as part of the sector funding they provided as a result of the pandemic. We received $71 million of additional research support package. The way we need to account for that is that we take all the revenue in the year it was provided, which was 2021, but we will have costs. Some of those costs have gone into 2021. A significant amount of those costs will come into 2022 results without any further revenue. In addition to that, we have between the 30 million and the 232 million, there are items that are not used for operational nature. They are insurance proceeds to remediate the hail damaged building. Again, the way we have to account for that is take that revenue up front when we receive insurance proceeds, even though the expenditure for that will come in the years to come. It will be recognised on the balance sheet as work in progress and will only hit the profit and loss once it's depreciated over the useful life of the asset. So that can be in the next 10, 15, 20 years, whatever the useful life of that asset remains. We also have, sorry, yes?
Because we have students who are not going to be, could you just explain the profit and loss statement and the balance sheet for people? Because I think it's maybe a term they will not be familiar with.
Sure. So the profit and loss, that really looks at our operational result. That takes into account all the revenue that we have received for the year. And that revenue is recognised, it varies based on conditions of that revenue. So if that revenue comes without any conditions, such as the research support funding that came, we need to spend it on research support, but that was the only condition, we recognise that all at once. If it comes with a condition attached, then we recognise it when we've met that actual condition. So there may be some research funding, for example, or tuition fees. We recognise those in the semester that we are teaching and that you have enrolled for. So that takes into account all the revenue received for the year. And then the other side of the P&L is the expenditure. So it takes into account all the expenditure received for the year. That is expenditure related to operating the university. It is not expenditure that's related to physical assets such as buildings and development of buildings. That will stay on the balance sheet as work in progress, and then it'll be capitalised as an asset once that asset is finalised. So the P&L is all operational revenue, all operational expenditure that relates to that year, and then you get the surplus or deficit being the the revenue minus the expenditure. The balance sheet, that looks at all the assets the university has, all the liabilities the university has, and all the equity. So the assets being, for example, our physical building. We have a long-term investment portfolio, which is made up of funding from endowments and philanthropy, as well as large liabilities where we have assets that need to fund large future liabilities like superannuation. They are kept as assets on the balance sheet. And liabilities on the balance sheet are things like accounts payable, for example, that we need to pay out, or for the other side of the superannuation, it's our superannuation obligations. And equity is really what the university has put in, or the owners of the organisation, In our case, the university has put in as earnings, retained earnings, etc., into the balance sheet. So the balance sheet is really a longer term, not related to one specific year. The P&L is really look at that year operations. So if we move on, I'll just walk through in a bit more detail the results. So as I said, we had expected a deficit of $120 million in the P&L. We ended up with $30 million. Did we get that wrong, or how did we get that so far off? I guess there's a couple of things that changed during the year that meant that we had a result that was better than budget. The first was we had additional revenue. We had $24 million in additional consultancy and contract revenue compared to what we had expected. It's quite hard to estimate exactly what your revenue is going to be. And if you think about it, we have revenue of $1.4 billion. So that variation of 24 million is not too significant in that, but that it helps us improve our result. We also had an additional $27 million in other revenue. That's made up of a lot of small amounts. It includes tuition fees, where we had better than expected tuition fees, and a lot of smaller revenue items that come in that are $1 million here and $2 million there. So they're made up of a lot of small things, but that totaled $27 million. That was additional revenue, hadn't expected it, so that improves our result. We then have a large item here of $45.9 million, which is related to salaries underspent. That is that the university has less employees during the year than what it expected. That is predominantly around the professional services space. So in that we mean IT resources, finance resources, so all the kind of resources that are not the academic resources. That is really a reflection of the very tight labour market that we have in Canberra and in Australia, where it's really difficult to recruit at the levels we need to recruit at. That means we haven't used all the budget we had expected on salaries, so we have quite a significant underspend that helps improve that operating result. That's not something we can keep going at that level. We do need to find ways to fill those roles so that we can actually deliver the services that you expect. In terms of the 53 million, that's in non-employee related expenses. So that includes things like research or field trips or anything that's not employee related. We have been underspent there. That is a reflection of not having the employees there as well to carry out all activities, but also a reflection of the lockdowns that we have faced in Canberra and Australia during 2021, which has prohibited us travelling and finalising on-field research, etc. That gets us to the operating result of $30 million. If we go to the next slide, please, Liv, we'll just talk through how do we get through that from that 30 million up to the 232 million that we report in our financial statements in the annual report and what we call our statutory result. So we have investment revenue. We have a very large long-term investment portfolio, as I mentioned, of about 1.4 billion. I say about because that moves on market movements. That's really invested in equities, in stock markets, etc. That is there to pay for our long superannuation obligations that we have taken over from the Commonwealth many years ago. It's also all the endowments that we have in there as well. That has a return that is broken into two parts, an unrealised part and a realised part. The unrealised part is really just looking at the market rates of those investments on the 31st of December. And from that, then we had an unrealised gain, a paper gain of $86.5 million. I can tell you that if you look at end of February, then we had lost $55 million of that, just as the market was impacted with the global movements earlier in the year. So that's something we don't use on operational activities until we have actually realised those investment gains. We did have $64 million of realised investment gains. That comes from dividends and interest, etc. That goes to fund the kind of distribution we have and the activities we can use out of our endowments and the return on those endowments. We had an impairment loss reversal. That was an entity ANU had invested in many, many years ago. Pre-2016, we had recognised the value of that investment down to zero. That company now has had quite a significant swing where they have very nicely improved their profit. That means that we have had to review our carrying balance of that investment, and we have then increased it from 0 upwards, and that has impacted us by 9.4 million. We have some deferred superannuation expenses, and in addition to that, we have 50 million of insurance proceeds that is really to be used on the hail damage and remediation of those buildings. That gets us to our $232 million reported profit. I can say that if we look forward, we do expect a deficit in 2022. We do expect a deficit in 2023. It's really 2024 before we start to break even and turn into a small surplus. Of course, things can change, as you see it has this year, but that's our expectation for going forward. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is really just to give you the equivalent full-time student load, so you understand the student numbers. This is in load rather than actual headcount, because that's how we look at it when we're looking at our financial results and analysis. We do have headcount also in the annual report, but here I focused on the student load. You'll see that in 2021, it was fairly comparable to 2020, slight increase, but not a massive change. And on the right there, you can see the split between the domestic, undergrad, postgrad, international, etc. I won't spend too much time on that here, just more or less to say it's a slight increase, but more or less the same as we had in 2020. If we go to the next slide, please, Pamela. Maybe just before I take this question, I'll just answer the question I see in the chat, which I think has come from James, because that still focuses on the part I've just talked about, in terms of how does a surplus mean we are in less debt rather than more money? What's the current profit and loss position when you ignore the stuff that is locked in, endowments, super, hail, insurance? So when you ignore the stuff that is endowments, super, hail, insurance, the stuff we can't use, that's the $30 million surplus. The 232 million includes all that stuff, but if you exclude that, it's the $30.2 million surplus. In terms of surplus, we don't necessarily have more money, because what we've said is that we are going to borrow in order to fund all those capital expenditures. So finalising the buildings, some IT infrastructure, etc. We need to borrow for those things. And we also have debt already today. So we also have obligations already today where we need to pay off existing debt. The university today has about $275 million of existing debt that it has taken pre-2015. Some of that goes back to 2004 even. So we are repaying that today. So the surpluses we're using need to be able to pay that, but they also need to fund the capital expenditure that we're doing. So James, hopefully that answers and makes it clearer for everyone. If we go on to the socially responsible investment, we have a socially responsible investment policy. The full report is released on our website, so you can read that in much more detail. But just in summary, we have a policy here that means we need to exclude companies from our investment portfolio that derive more than 20% of revenue from gambling, tobacco, pornography, or coal. We need to hold a domestic equities portfolio, so our Australian equities portfolio, with 25% less carbon intensity than that of the S&P and ASX 200. And we need to ensure that the portfolio demonstrates a 10% improvement in the overall ESG rating relative to the benchmark. Our achievements in 2021 are quite good against all these items that we have in our policy. We have 99.59% of the long-term investment portfolio compliant with the university SRI policy. The very small amount that's not, they were investments that were made prior to the policy being in place, and they're currently in runoff. So we haven't gone and said we're going to sell off those investments and take any hit. We're actually running those investments off. So we're pretty good, and I expect that to get closer to 100% during the year. We have an aggregate total of 42.25% lower carbon intensity than our benchmark, despite the carbon intensity of the benchmark also declining by 10%. That's including our international and domestic equity portfolio. If we just take the domestic equity portfolio, that is 30% better than the S&P ASX 200. And what we have done is we've agreed with Council now that from 2022 onwards, we'll have a new target in our policy that is for our international equities to have a carbon intensity that's 75% less than the benchmark. And we can do more in the international equities versus the Australian equities because the Australian ASX 200 is very, very heavy in natural resources. And that makes it difficult for us to be able to get that carbon intensity really down. And we need to balance our fiduciary responsibility with our socially responsible investment policy. And we do have obligations in that long-term investment portfolio around superannuation and our endowments that we need to manage that fiduciary responsibility. So we're not able to go down to zero or to be able to do much more on that when we balance those two. But of course, we'll focus on continuing to improve that. So that's what I had, and happy to take questions. I see one's popped up, so let me just quickly read it. So yes, James, the 30 million surplus is making the debt repayment that was due in 2021, but not the future debt repayments.
So I think that question is that the 30 million surplus, we have paid our interest on past debts. So the $30 million surplus for 2021 is about where you want to be in a university under normal times. But it is unfortunately sort of a one-off glitch that we got into a reasonable position, and it will not be that way for 2022 and 2023. We will have to take on debt, which we will then pay off over many, many years in the future. But it's an extraordinary time, and we think we can manage that debt. Fair enough, Anna?
Yep. Yes.
All right, I'd like now, we'll have time for more questions, but I'd like to move on to Mark Kenny. Mark, why don't you reflect a little bit on, we're halfway, we're only halfway through the election being called, but give us the halfway point view of the election for our students.
Sorry about that delay there, Brian, and thank you for your introduction. Yes, I am Mark Kenny. I'm in the School of Politics and International Relations and the Australian Studies Institute. And some of you may recognise me from programs like Insiders and The Drum and those types of things. I've been doing that for a long time as a political journalist prior to coming to ANU. So obviously I'm very interested in this election, as I have been in all elections, and I think obviously there's a great deal of interest from voters in this election. It could be an important one. As Brian said, we're around the halfway mark at the moment. The election's on May 21. There'll be some voting that goes on before that. If you're choosing to exercise a pre-poll vote or a postal vote, you can go about doing that. I think probably from next week. There's a 2-week window in which that can occur. It's a tough task for both sides really at the moment to get a majority in their own right. The government at the moment, the coalition government, has 76 seats in the House of Reps. That's exactly what you need for half+1 in the 151-member House of Representatives. That's where government is formed. If you're an international student, you may be watching this with some degree of mystification or unease, not working out exactly what's going on. It can be quite confusing, but I'd certainly encourage you to continue watching it, because I do think this is a very interesting election, even if in policy terms we don't see a whole lot of really imaginative policy being put on the table or any big risks being taken by either side at the moment. That said, we are really in the sort of business end of this, and there's going to be some pretty interesting developments, I think, in the coming weeks. Anthony Albanese, the person who wants Scott Morrison's job, has had a rough start to the campaign and then has had a period of COVID where he's been in isolation. He's just come out of that today. I noticed literally minutes before starting to speak to you today that Richard Marles, the Deputy Labor leader, has just put on Twitter that he's just tested positive. So he won't be at Labor's launch, Labor's official campaign launch, which happens in Perth on Sunday. And which presumably there'll be some more policy detail outlined, but it just proves that COVID is continuing to ravage this election campaign like it's ravaged so much else. It is a difficult task, as I say, for both sides to get to that majority. If you look at the polling, after all the sort of heat and dust and noise and argument that we've seen so far, the polling suggests that Labor is in front, two-party preferred, about 53% to 47% to the coalition. That's a slight narrowing on where things were when they started, but it still shows Labor in a strong position. Now, that said, Labor was in an equally strong position in the 2019 election, and as we know, did not win that election. So polling is not predictive. It's really a snapshot, and the extent to which it's accurate is also a matter of some conjecture. So we don't want to put too much store in that. I won't sort of bore you with too many sort of specifics about this election campaign, because if you're interested in it, you will have been noticing these things generally. But obviously, one of the most interesting factors about this campaign is the rise of independents. And that goes to my point about why it's hard to see either side getting to a majority. It doesn't mean that there won't be a majority for either the existing government or for Labor. But a lot of that does turn on how a number of independents go in seats that are mostly held by the coalition, and which are mostly regarded as safe seats held by the coalition in the inner cities. And that's the case for Josh Frydenberg's seat of Kooyong, which is described as a Liberal jewel and has been in the Liberal Party's hands forever. He's under serious assault from one of these so-called teal independents. And there's a number of others around the country that are also making very strong pitches for those seats. And there's a lot of support for them, but whether there'll be enough support in any individual seat to get them over the line, that is the big unknown at this stage. It's a very hard thing to do, to take a seat in the House of Representatives. Much easier to do it in the Senate, where you just have to pick up a percentage of the vote across a whole state to put together a quota for a Senate spot. But in the House of Reps, where you've got to get to 50% plus one after preferences are distributed, that's pretty hard. I'll just make one final observation and leave you with that, and that is what's not being talked about in this election. We're not getting much talk about tax. We're not getting much talk about budget balance. That's something that's been a staple of elections in the past, but of course the budget is nowhere near balanced at the moment. We're heading towards $1.2 trillion of gross debt and budget deficit in the most recent budget of $80 billion or near enough too. So neither side is talking about balancing the budget. Those dynamics have changed, but they're not talking about some other things as well. They're not talking about universities, for example. Brian mentioned that one-off research funding, which has been of assistance, but universities were kept out of JobKeeper, and no one seems to be coming up with an idea for how universities can be better funded and how the sector can be protected and grown in this, to meet the challenges of a sophisticated economy going forward. So that's a bit of a shame. Similarly, there's relative silence in sort of key areas like health as well, and housing. Housing is there's an ongoing housing crisis, and neither side really has anything particularly structural to address that. So perhaps these things are going to feature in the second half of this campaign. Let's hope that is the case. But it's going to be a very interesting election, and it could be one of the few where we see a change of government, but nothing is certain. Can I leave you with one sort of plug, if I can? As part of ANU's election engagement, I suppose, public engagement, this year we're doing a number of podcasts. My podcast, Democracy Sausage, which is particularly successful. We've done a live podcast here on the campus last week or a couple of weeks ago. We're doing another one with Policy Forum, so it's a joint podcast, but it's done live in front of an audience, and that's happening this coming Wednesday. And if you're interested in politics and policy, we'd really encourage you to come along. That's I think at 6 p.m. this coming Wednesday, and you can easily find reference to that and register to come along to that. And it's a lot of fun as well as being informative. So engage in that if you can. And with that, I'll hand back to Brian. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Mark. And I do encourage people to get your friends out and, take part of some of the things that are happening on the university. You just don't get a chance to do anywhere else. So happy to open the floor to any questions on anything, what we've discussed or otherwise. Raise your hand, put into the chat, or email to the address as in the chat. And it's always hard to get the first questions out, although I do congratulate James for asking questions on the chat to hopefully get people started. So go forth and, as I said, we'll do our best to answer. I encourage you not to be shy. All right, I think did I just see, I saw someone look like they, for a second, wanted to put up their hand.
James has his hand up.
All right, I don't know why that's not showing up on my screen, but James, over to you. Please unmute.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for being really informative. I'm sorry that I've got the first three questions in a row here, but I don't know if this is true or not, but I want to just confirm or deny that. But I heard earlier this year that potentially we've spent more at ANU on redundancy payments for staff who lost their jobs than if we just kept them on salaries and paying them as normal, particularly like the loss of a lot of like the tutors and the early career people. Is that true? Surely that's not true, right?
Well, you gotta, so it's not completely true, and it's not completely false in one way. It depends on how you look at it. So the university has a long-term budget issue that is going to persist for 5 years and beyond. One thing that we very strongly believe, we had to shed 10% of our staff, so 470 people, and we try to look after our staff. And we have, a very strong enterprise agreement, which has what happens if people, for example, decide to take a voluntary redundancy, and almost everyone who left, like more than 99% of the people, took voluntary redundancies. And so we pay them out because it's not easy to suddenly not have a job. And, we don't want people living on the streets. So there is a fair bit of cost that you pay in the first year, but then you have their salary savings for decades, okay? And it allows you to renew the university. We often would have, for example, a professor like I will be in about 10 years, 65, maybe it's time to retire and use my superannuation. And I could be replaced with a young version of me, like when I came to ANU in 1995. So there's a bunch of trade-offs like that. But in a given year, it is a very big expense in that year, but it provides savings for the year to come. So that's why it is that way.
Okay, thanks, Brian.
Yeah. Thank you. Other people with questions, please, anything you ever wanted to ask, now is the time to do it. Kirby, you can unmute.
Yep. So I've prepared a question. It might be overly conceptual for this sort of meeting, but I'll give it a go anyway. It's been my experience and the experience of many residents that the university intervenes to perhaps an extreme degree in the day-to-day goings-on at colleges, at residential colleges. For example, on the 25th of April, the ACT lifted mask mandates for indoor spaces at schools, yet masks are still required inside residential colleges, which are ultimately the homes of the people for thousands of students at ANU. So why is it that matters like these are not left up to the discretion of the administration of the college and/or hall? And why is the university spending resources to employ people in their COVID office to make decisions that could and should be made by the leadership of the colleges and halls? By contrast, the colleges at Melbourne University have been able to decide almost the entirety of their policies surrounding COVID. Ormond, for example, momentarily shut down, while by contrast, University College, I think, only ever imposed mask mandates. and don't right now. Another example of perhaps the university's overreach is the requirement to get university approval to hold functions and events on the grounds of colleges and halls. So why does the university use scarce resources to employ people to decide whether, for example, Bergman College can have an inflatable castle on their back lawn, or whether Wright Hall can hold a party on their own pavilion, or whether Burton and Garron can have a concert in their common room? Again, surely matters such as these should be left up to the leadership of the hall and only the leadership of the hall. So I guess my ultimate question is, why, given this fact, given this desire for self-determination, does the university employ numerous staff to make centralized decisions that affect the domestic experience and indeed lives of residents at ANU at the cost of self-determination?
All right. Interesting question. And so there's a few things to unpack there, and I'm not sure if anyone else will want to of my team will want to go in. But the first thing to understand is comparison with, for example, the Melbourne residences. Those residences are genuinely independent from the university, and so the university, well, they kind of coexist. There is genuine governance independence. The residents here, except for Johns and Bergman, are owned, and we have legal responsibilities at ANU for those residences. So we have a different governance responsibility. We have worked with Johns and Bergman to more seamlessly interact with them so that students get what I would describe as a relatively even experience across the university, especially when it comes to things like behavior. We've talked around sexual violence, and trying to get something where we have a safe campus across the board is sort of feeding what we are our actions there. So let's talk about something like COVID. We are an ecosystem on this campus that has a higher degree of student involvement on campus than any place else, an order of magnitude higher than Melbourne or Sydney. Because of that, we have a unique set of responsibilities to students and to staff because we are more closely coupled. And so, yes, we have this greater role in the governance, but we also have a different ecosystem. Now, we do try to find the balance between, I would say, not intervening too much versus providing I would say, an environment that has a broad set of appeals to as many people from a diverse set of backgrounds as possible. So that is the trade-off one does in intervening. And as I said, I think we do understand that the mask mandates in campuses need to be reviewed, as well as some of the other activities, but ultimately it is all university land with our overall responsibility to the whole community. So we try to find the balance, but I don't think we would be comfortable to just let pure self-governance reign within the university residences, because we have seen that has led to very poor outcomes at other universities where that's occurred. If you haven't had a chance to read the book about the New Hampshire community that decided to get rid of its governance and the Bears ended up taking over the city, it's a worthwhile read. So there is use for residents to be having some level of regulation. But I agree, we can sometimes come in too hard and over the top, and it's for us to find that balance. I'm not sure if anyone else within the team wants to add anything on that, but I think that's sort of the balance we're trying to find, and we're happy to have the conversation with you to try to find the correct balance. But I think complete laissez-faire, I can tell you, having seen it in place at most other universities at some point, including this one. It's led to quite poor outcomes for individuals, would be my reading of it. But thank you. It's a good provocative question, and I do understand what your concern is. Other questions? All right, well, I am not going to extract questions from you like if you were in my cosmology class, where I tend to load you up with chocolate and other treats if you ask questions. But if you do have questions that come to mind in the hours, days, months, and years ahead, you can always write in. Indeed, that VC messages email that I think we have posted right up at the top of this, vc.messages@ANU. It's always a good way if you have a comment, concern, question, whatever. Please feel free to use that. And if you as students have topics and things that you would like to discuss with me and the other university leaders, your college leaders, whatever, pipe up, and we're always happy to sit down and have a conversation. And just like Kirby's question there, I think it's a bit of understanding where the pain points are and trying to find solutions that maybe are more balanced, all things. That's a way we should be working together to try to find things that get you 90% of the way where you need to be without, I think, undermining what our governance obligations are. So without further ado, thank you all. Please go out, get immunized with flu, get your third COVID shot if you haven't done that, register to vote, and we'll see you around campus. Thank you, everyone.